Okay, well, thank you, Mikolaj, for inviting me. I'd like to thank Agnieszka for preparing as well. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Oxford. I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. And the first part, I'd like to offer a critique of what I call the elusiveness narrative about Auschwitz. What was known about the mass murder of Jews and Auschwitz during the war? The general consensus for a long time has been that this was not known until the arrival of a report in June 1944, the Werber-Wetzler report, which I'm sure everyone is very familiar with. Now, there are various ways we can go about critiquing that narrative, and I'm going to do it in two ways. I'm going to be highlighting that there was more information available than has hitherto been recognised, and also I'm going to point out some of the problems with the evidentiary base for that elusiveness narrative. And then I'm going to move on to talk about two main arguments in my book. One is about the regime of British information management, or censorship as I call it in the book, and also about the path of information from essentially Poland to London, what happened to it, where it's stored, what are the problems with its dissemination. And if I have time, and I don't know whether I will, I want to talk about the role of historians, both now and in the wartime period. And I'm going to focus in on the story of Carl McCartney, who is a key figure in the internal flow of information about Hungary in the period from May 1944 onwards. It's a very interesting story which I don't think scholars have paid much attention to. So, we can start with a slide on the knowledge of the camp, which scholars have had up to about 2012, 2013. And the initial assertion that the camp was not known was made probably by Martin Gilbert. And we can understand Martin Gilbert's book, Auschwitz and the Allies, as either codifying a belief about knowledge of the camp up to that point in the Second World War, or we can see it as the beginning of a very troubling myth. And if you look at the first two and the sixth entry, which I've underlined and put in bold, I'm going to look at those particular entries in somewhat more detail. There are particular problems with the way in which source material about that information has been understood and used both by Gilbert and by subsequent scholars. I mean, the assertion which I'm trying to defend is that scholars since 1981, when Auschwitz and the Allies was first published, have not returned to the source material. I think it's quite evident that no one really checked the source material, and I think that's very problematic in terms of our scholarly practice. Now, one of the narrative tropes about knowledge of Auschwitz is that information arrived in a drip fashion. That, you'd have a little spark of information here, a spark of information there, but there was no coherence to it. And so that people who received this information may have received the information, but they didn't take it in. They didn't really comprehend the systematic basis of what was happening. And I think we can contest that even on the information which Gilbert refers to. Now, since that time, there have been a number of challenges to this elusiveness narrative, one of which came very early in a review of Auschwitz and the Allies in 1985 by Richard Brightman. And basically his point was that there was more information. And he points out several pieces of additional information which Gilbert kind of missed. So the question is, if there's more information, how much more information was required before scholars will reconsider this particular narrative? Is it 12 pieces? 16 pieces of information? At what point do we stop and say, let's reconsider the framing of this particular story that we're telling ourselves? In 1999, Barbara Rogers, who was at that stage still a PhD student, went to the National Archives in Kew and found several additional pieces of information. This has just been released in the mid-1990s and published this in the Journal of Holocaust Education. So this is a significant journal on Holocaust studies. Now, since that time, no one really has referred to this piece of work. This is an important intervention, and you would have thought that maybe at this point, when you have double the amount of information that had previously been thought to be available, now available to scholars, maybe you change your mind or maybe relook at the elusive narrative. But what we get is a reassertion of the narrative in the 2000s. So if you look at just a selection of these scholars, we only see one scholar temporarily suspending his belief in this idea that Auschwitz was unknown, the true function of Auschwitz was unknown. So, Gilbert reasserts it in his preface to the 2001 edition of the book. We see Jan van Pelt, we see Ruth Lynn, we see Medoff as well, all reasserting this idea. Interestingly, of course, is that none of these scholars engage with Barbara Rogers' work. I mean, she's not mentioned much, and if you do a search on how often she's mentioned, it's very rarely, if at all. So what we have here is an ignorance of the scholarship that is available. Brightman, Rogers, as well. So we need to think, well, what's going on here? What's happening? And I think one way that we can get a grip on this elusiveness narrative is just to return to the source material. And if you return to the source material, we have got some interesting things come to light. Now, what you'll notice about this list of information available is the striking absence of any real engagement with Polish intelligence. There is no real engagement with Polish intelligence operations. The assumption is the information from Poles wasn't passed on. And if we think about what's happening in the 1980s, maybe that's a kind of believable story. If you think about the poor relations between, or the poor reputation of Poland, especially after the 1968 anti-Semitic campaign, maybe the idea that Poland kept hold of the information, if it received any information about what's happening at Auschwitz, is believable. But it wasn't really tested. Now, in 1968, the Auschwitz State Museum published a special volume of its regular journal, and this is it. This is an image of it, and basically this particular edition lists and describes and discusses the information which the Polish underground gathered and apparently sent to London. Now, this journal was available in the West in the 1970s. Walter LaCure refers to this particular journal in his landmark The Terrible Secret, published in 1980. So you would have thought that anyone who's interested in the story about knowledge of Auschwitz would, at least in some occasions, engage with this particular text. It's available, as I say, in the West, as well as other material, including material from the Polish Ministry of the Interior, which was available in the British Library from the mid-1970s. So if we return to the source material, we can look at some of the assertions which are made in Auschwitz and the Allies. And one of the first reports, or in fact the first report that Gilbert mentions, is a report from a lady from Sosnowiec, dated the 25th of November 1942. It's not clear entirely where he gets the date 25th of November from. I suspect it's a mistake. But the argument that the unknown destination became one of the best secrets of the war is not in fact true. So what we find is, if we look to the New York Times on the 25th of November, we find this rather striking page. And on this page, which arguably is probably the most important page in the American paper of record that was published up to that point, we have three big stories. We have the story about Stephen Wise's information about the Rhino Telegram. He's declared that he met with Sumner Wells. We also have a story about the Polish government's press release of the 24th of November. And at the very bottom of the page, we have this very interesting sentence, which is information which arrives in New York from Jerusalem. The information comes from Jerusalem because in early November, mid-November, you have Jewish returnees from Poland who had been exchanged for German prisoners arriving in Palestine. These returnees are telling the Jewish leadership in Palestine what they saw, what they know. One of these people is this lady from Sosnowiec. She's the woman who's talking about Auschwitz. So on the 25th of November 1942, we have this paragraph in the New York Times talking about the slaughter of Jews includes accounts of trainloads of adults and children taken to the great crematoriums of Auschwitz near Krakow. It's clear as day. Okay, this information was translated and was transmitted to New York. Now, this was a meeting, a press meeting, so we can ask, why didn't the London Times report this same information? There's a lot of information in the London Times around the same period of time which doesn't mention what was happening at Auschwitz. So it's an interesting juxtaposition between the information which was published in New York and that published in London. But we can go further. What happened next to this information? Well, it was compiled together in a significant report which was passed to President Roosevelt on the 8th of December 1942 and signed by various Jewish organisations. And we see more or less the same kind of language being used in this report. Now, this report eventually reaches London and the Foreign Office at the beginning of January 1943. The first person to point that out is Barbara Rogers in 1999. So this information from Jerusalem makes it ultimately to the Foreign Office in the beginning of January 1943. So the story that we get from that about the reports from the ladies from Sosnowiec actually does make it into the Western world, makes it into the American paper of record, makes it to President Roosevelt, and makes it to the Foreign Office. So that's the first report that we can talk about. If we move on, the second significant report is this report from a Polish courier on 18th of April 1943. Now, if you just read how it's presented in Auschwitz and the Allies, I think a reasonable person would assume that the information stalled, probably with the Polish government in exile. If you just read that text, there's no mention of who it's made public for, who was the report being drafted for. We don't have any clear information of why it wasn't made public, and we don't really know where this poll had been for 11 months. These are all key questions. And then we've got to look at the references, and we find out that the document was stored or located in Yad Vashem. So it must be quite interesting to find out, well, how to get Yad Vashem. So we go back to the source material. And when we go back to the source material, we find these two very interesting letters. The report was written by a Polish courier who was trained by SOE. So for the 11 months prior to being in Poland, he was in England being trained by SOE. He goes to see Ignacy Schwarzbart, a member of the Polish National Council, delivers his report. Schwarzbart has this report. He translates it immediately into English, and then he goes to see some colleagues, Jewish colleagues in London. And we have the evidence here. And so basically he sends it out to colleagues in London, to New York, to Palestine. Because he sends it out of Britain, it's intercepted. It's intercepted by press and censorship people, who in turn pass it on to the Foreign Office. And the Foreign Office has this report. Now, this particular information has been sitting available in the National Archives in Kew since 1972, so anyone could go and take it out. Now, what is interesting about this particular document is the commentary. There's some really very interesting commentary about it. There is no comment at all on Auschwitz or the mass murder of Jews in the actual document itself. But on the cover sheet, there is a interesting annotation, and it says basically, pass page 3 being the page dealing with Auschwitz, to Roger Allen. Roger Allen is the Foreign Office official who is collecting information on atrocities. So this suggests to us that Roger Allen is collecting material about what's happening to various people, including Jews, in relation to German atrocities. So we are beginning to get some sense that the assertion that this information wasn't passed on or was unknown is quite porous, it's quite weak. We can move on to the final piece of information which I think I'd like to talk about. And this is a report printed by the Polish Consulate General in Istanbul in a bulletin, Poland under German occupation, from the 15th of March 1944. And there are a number of questions which this document raises. Why published in Istanbul? What was the target audience of the consulate's bulletin? What else did the bulletin print? And where did Gilbert find a copy of this particular bulletin? So if we dig up in the archives, both in the Polish archives and archives in London, we can find out that Istanbul is a key crossroads point for intelligence operations. It's a big centre for Polish intelligence operations. This is where information from Poland, a lot of information from Poland, filters through to Istanbul and from Istanbul out to the wider world. It's also a big centre for the British, for the German, and indeed for the Jewish agency, who've got representation in Istanbul. So it's a big centre. So the reason why the Polish consulate is publishing information in its bulletin is because it's going to reach this wider audience. And we can point to the fact that it wasn't only published in Polish. The Polish consulate in Istanbul published 2 bulletins, one in Polish, one in French. It's clearly aimed at the international audience. Now, what else did this bulletin publish? Well, it repeatedly published about what was happening at Auschwitz from 1943 onwards. So in May 1943, we have news of 500,000 Jews being killed at Auschwitz, being published in both the French and the Polish version. So, the idea that this was being suppressed by the Poles really doesn't really stand up for much of a test. So here we just see these 2 different bulletins. And on the bottom piece, you can see the French version. This is the French version from May 1943, just describing, as I just said, that over 500,000 Jews had been killed at Auschwitz. So that's the first part. So basically, we can say that the evidentiary base underpinning the assertion that Auschwitz was unknown is very weak. If we look at the archival material, we go back to the archives, we can find out that the claims or the evidence justifying that particular interpretation actually tells us something else. It tells us that information was passed on and was more robust and more broad than Gilbert gives credit for. And my point is not to criticise a book which was published 34 years ago, but really to point to the fact that scholars haven't really done their job. They haven't been back to the archives to check. So that's the main point. They haven't really contested a particular narrative, and maybe what we should be thinking about is not, the facts as such, but how come a particular narrative or myth has had such traction over the last 35 years? And I think that's probably the more interesting question. So what I've tried to do in the book is 2 things. Is to really document how many intelligence reports, how much information actually arrived in the West. And you may have noticed on the first slide that I showed you, the information is a bit of a jumble. You have source reports, i.e. eyewitness testimony, mixed up with distributed data, i.e. in a bulletin. I think it's very important to understand how information flowed, is to understand the place particular information occupies on an information chain. Is it source data? Is it distributed data? If it's source data, we need to know what happened to it. If it's distributed data, we need to know what's the source, how did it get to where it got to, and where else did it go to? And if we can do that, we can get a better picture of how information arrived in Britain, the United States, and even in Australia, and we can understand this information better. So this particular slide shows you 23 source reports. That's source reports. That's only a sample of the actual amount. The actual amount of source reports which arrived in the West is probably nearer 48, 49, maybe even 50. I found 46, I think, prior to the arrival of the Werber Wetzel report. Now, some of these reports were distributed in multiple fora. So one probably went to at least 12, 13 different locations, newspapers, bulletins, radio. It was distributed into Australia, New York, Los Angeles, and so on and so forth. So there's so much information. You could probably even argue that there's more information about what's happened to Jews at Auschwitz than maybe at some of the other death camps or other camps in general. So there's a lot of information. So the next question is, if there's so much information available, why didn't it really hit the British mainstream press? Why wasn't it on the British Broadcasting Corporation's home service? And I think there are a number of different ways we can go about answering this, but ultimately we can fit it under the rubric of the idea of a censorship regime. This is not so much traditional ideas of censorship where some guys in an office saying you can't do this, you can't do that. It's a more of a collaborative engagement between Ministry of Information, Minister of Information, newspaper editors, broadcasters. And the reason why news of atrocities against Jews is problematic, there are multiple reasons. We can think about British foreign policy, we can think about the way in which news about atrocities, news about Jews especially, could stimulate domestic anti-Semitism. We can think about the way in which the British press was receiving information or advice from the Foreign Office, from Minister Bracken as well. So there's a whole range of ways we can interpret this. And I think something came up quite recently in relation to the Queen's Nazi salute. Maybe some of you saw this. And there was a nice piece in the newspaper by Peter Preston. And he writes that in the 1930s, Prime Minister Baldwin could summon the press lords of Fleet Street and persuade them not to tell their readers what London in the know had been buzzing about for months. The BBC predictably trooped along behind. And I think more or less the same happened in the 1940s with Brendan Bracken, generally suggesting that they might not want to print some information. And I also think that newspaper editors were more than happy to go along with that. I don't think they put up much of a fight to go against British policy in relation to this and for their own internal reasons. Now, having said that, if we think about how news of the Holocaust was distributed in Britain, there are two significant exceptions. The first one is subsequent to the arrival of the Bund report in May 1942. This report revealed to its readers that 700,000 Jews had been killed in Poland up to that point. Now that arrives at the end of May. Prime Minister Sikorski alludes to it in beginning of June, but it's not mentioned in the British mainstream press until the end of June 1942. Between the beginning of June and the end of June, we know that Shmuel Ziegelboim was very active in trying to get this information out into the public, and he eventually succeeds in persuading the Daily Telegraph to publish it. And I suspect that Bracken tacitly allowed it. And I think what we see in this upsurge in publication around from 25th of June to about the 9th, 10th of July is a relaxation of the regime of information management, but more particularly tensions between the Ministry of Information and the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office was not keen on this information at all, whereas I think the Minister of Information, maybe with some support from Churchill, I'm speculating, had a different view. And what we see over the course of the summer in microcosm is basically British regime of information being played out. In August, interestingly, in August 1942, the Labour Party publishes on a second report, which arrived on the 22nd of June, which discussed Hell No. And this is a report which draws on eyewitness testimony from 3 gravediggers who had escaped from Helmno the previous January. And it published this very frank report in its internal bulletin to members of the Labour movement. By the time we get to August and late August and the beginning of September, we see the Labour Party as a whole back in line with the Foreign Office. And we have this big meeting at Caxton Hall on the 2nd of September 1942. And it's all muted. There is nothing really that explicit being said. And indeed, at that meeting, a resolution put forward by Ziegel, Boyman, Adam Chalkosz of the Polish Socialist Party that the Labour Party should endorse the motion that the British should do something to end the orgy of violence which is taking place in occupied Europe, was just simply ignored. It never moved forward beyond the executive branch of the Labour Party. It was more or less buried. The second period of relaxation comes in late November, December 1942. In late November, we see Sumner Wells verifying the information in the Rhiner Telegram from the August of 1942. We see a lot of pressure from Jewish representatives and Polish representatives on the British for some statement. And this statement is given on the 17th of December in the form of the UN Declaration, which I'm sure everyone is quite familiar with. But then after that, we look at 1943. In the British press, the news just fades away. You know, there are occasional reports in newspapers. There are occasional updates on the radio. We can think about a report in December 1943, which more or less marks the anniversary of the UN Declaration. And there are various others, but generally speaking, it's a drip of information into the public domain. So what we have is a situation where key players in the Foreign Office and elsewhere in the British government administration are aware of what's going on, but the British public are not. The problem with that is that civil society organisations cannot galvanise the public to raise their voice as much as they may have done. Now, information wasn't completely suppressed. There were some newspapers which did publish some information, and probably the best example is this newspaper, the Polish Jewish Observer. This newspaper was a subscription-only newspaper. It came with the City and East London Observer. It was published from around February 1942 all the way through to more or less the end of the war. It was edited by a journalist called Joel Sang. Sang had been the Manchester Guardian's man in Warsaw prior to the war. He also worked for the Daily Herald. He would also, during the 1930s, provide much of Fleet Street with copy. During the 1930s, interestingly, the Polish embassy in London was very interested in Sang, in a negative way, very interested in what he was reporting. And they had a number of inquiries about his journalism. And what Sang does during the 1942, 1943, 1944 is publish news about the Holocaust in explicit detail. And many of the reports that you find in this newspaper are English translations of Polish intelligence reports. So we have in this newspaper report after report after report through 1943 and into 1944 about what's happening to Jews in Auschwitz. The next question is, who's reading this newspaper? Well, we know British intelligence was reading this newspaper. We also know that the Secretary of the Board of Deputies was reading this newspaper. And we also know that the people compiling the weekly political intelligence summary, people working for the Foreign Office Research Department, were also reading this newspaper. So this newspaper was read by people who needed to read it. Now the question is, did they read this information? Did they believe these stories? Well, quite probably, because they could work out where this information came from. The Poles were passing on information through various different channels, and so they could check exactly where the source was from, even if they didn't bother to ask Joel Sang himself. Now, Sang is also interesting. There's an ironic twist to this kind of story. Joel Sang is trying to push this information into the public domain, whereas the British state administration is not so keen. And the ironic twist is this: in 1947, Sang applies for British naturalisation, and the person who endorses his naturalisation is no other than Cavendish Bentinck. Cavendish Bentinck was the ambassador in Warsaw during this period, but before that, during the war, he was the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee. So he's a key intelligence figure who's advising people on what's true and what's not. I find that's quite an interesting twist. So we have this report, and the report that you see in this newspaper here is actually from a Polish intelligence report, which was written in December 1943. This is from June 1943. And it goes through various channels and eventually reaches London. It's distributed to the Polish cabinet on the 15th of December 1943. It eventually works its way into a Polish press release on the 21st of March, which is not reported in the mainstream British press at all. But it is picked up by papers in the United States. So we have this big press release by the Polish government talking about 500,000 Jews being killed at Auschwitz. The Los Angeles Times published the news on the 22nd of March. The New York Herald Tribune publishes the news. The Washington Post, which I think we all agree is not an insignificant paper, publishes the news as well. On the 23rd of March, newspapers in Australia are publishing the news. So Britain is an exception here. Britain is not publishing the news. Everyone else in the Western world seems to be publishing the information. So that goes back to the point of how and why it was being contained in Britain. But we also know that that same report, which was first compiled in June, July and August 1943, reached Palestine. And what we see here is an extract from the Bulletin of the Jewish Agency Committee for the Jews of Occupied Europe from February 1944. And we see reference to what's happening at Auschwitz here. So the people who needed to know, I think we can argue, had the information. Okay, there was plenty of information about. If you were interested in what was happening to the Jews of Europe, you know where to look. Okay, it was no big deal. The people who didn't know is probably the general public and certain people in various ministries lower down the hierarchy in the British state apparatus. Now, just looking at time, I see I've got about 10 minutes left. So I'd just like to move on quickly and just give you some flavour of how information was controlled. And I think, as scholars, we are always interested in how scholars operate in these crisis situations. C.A. McCartney, very well-known historian. His works during the war has been written about. There's a very interesting programme on BBC Radio 4, document, that looks at his advice to the Political Warfare Executive, the body which is responsible for propaganda to occupied Europe, and how he recommended in 1942 that news about Jews should be marginalised or indeed excluded from broadcasts. What's less well known is that in 1943 he assumes a role in the Foreign Office Research Department, and the Foreign Office Research Department is responsible for compiling the Weekly Political Intelligence Summary. The Weekly Political Intelligence Summary is the weekly report which is distributed to members of the British governing class. 534 copies are distributed, and this goes to ministers, top civil servants, top person at the BBC, the Prime Minister, the King and Queen. You get the idea. It goes to the important people. So what was C.A. McCartney doing in this very important crisis period after the invasion of or occupation of Hungary by the Germans from the 19th of March 1944 onwards? What we can do is juxtapose what's in the Weekly Political Intelligence Summary with what's in the political, directives of the Political Warfare Executive, which are essentially the instructions to what the BBC should be broadcasting. So we've got those two things that we can compare. We can also juxtapose it with what we know was in London, what information was available. So we can imagine what was on McCartney's desk in March, April, May, June 1944 relating to Hungarian Jews. And we get quite a detailed picture of what he had, because we know the kind of sources that he had. He had access to ciphers from Bletchley Park. He had access to newspapers from newspaper reports from Sweden. There was a big press reading room in Stockholm. He had access to information from his own contacts in London, and so on and so forth. And so he also worked occasionally for the PWE into this period, and the information flow between Ford and PWE, we can argue, was pretty tight. So basically what was known to the political warfare executive and what was known to Ford should correspond, more or less. There's not going to be massive differences between the two. The main difference is the audience to which this information is then going to be directed to. Hungarian public, the British ruling class or the governing class. And so we can look at this broadcast on the BBC Hungarian service from the 6th of May 1944, very late at night, 11:15 at night. And what we see there is news about Hungarian Jews and people being transported and thrown into the notorious concentration camp at Auschwitz. So the process of deportation is known quite early on. And so what I've done in this table is just to list by date these two different sources of information. And what is very interesting, I think, is what happens in the key month of June 1944. And what we see in the information being passed to the British governing class is that information about what's happened to Hungarian Jews more or less ceases. It stops. And whereas the political warfare executive is calming its propaganda pitch down, it's still there. So if we look at the entry for the 7th of June 1944, we see the Weekly Political Intelligence Summary reporting that the Germans intend to transport, whereas in the Political Warfare Executive, it is reliably reported that the first batches of Hungarian Jews have now been sent to where they are put in death camps. And it goes on, and then the 28th of June, there is no reference to Jews whatsoever, which is particularly interesting because on the 25th of June 1944, the Home Service mentions a camp in Galicia, which is an oblique reference to Auschwitz. It's oblique, but we know that the BBC and other press organisations had the name of the camp. They just didn't choose to reveal at that point. We also know that on the 24th and 25th of June, the Archbishop of Canterbury receives a lot of information from the World Council of Churches in Geneva, which would have passed through British censorship. It passed through British censorship. We can make an argument that maybe it passed its way up the line to people in British intelligence and to McCartney. So what we have here is, it seems to me, some evidence of the way in which news about what was happening in Hungary is being reported to the British governing class. And this is important because around the end of June, we see increased civil society activity for a proactive response. What the Foreign Office is doing here, it seems to me, is trying to mitigate against that intervention. They're saying to their colleagues in other departments, be cautious about this information. Now, when that policy of excluding information from the Weekly Political Intelligence Summary breaks down due to the press reports in Switzerland, the intervention of the King of Sweden, and so on, there is doubt cast upon the information, or rather the Foreign Office doesn't imprint its authority on the information it receives by saying it comes from Polish sources or it comes from Jewish agency sources. It doesn't say this is actually the information that we think is the case. So basically it's pursuing the same policy goal of not endorsing the information, but through different means. June is exclusion. In July, it's marginalisation. We should say, in relation to McCartney, that from March 1944 onwards, there is reporting about what's happening in Hungary, which is a complete change from what was happening earlier. In the period prior to March 1944, in the entire political intelligence summary, there are 5 mentions of Jews in Hungary. That's it, period. So just to close, I think we need to reach a number of conclusions. One is that the sheer scale of information about Auschwitz really puts the elusive narrative to bed, in my view. I think we cannot go along with that anymore. Now, I don't think that the elusiveness narrative is going to die. I don't think people will do that. I think the idea that the camp was elusive has been persuasive for so long because it's taken on the form of a myth. And speculatively, I suspect that one of the reasons why it's been so powerful is that there is an ongoing debate in the study of the Holocaust about the knowability or the representability of the Holocaust. And in some way, I think the idea that Auschwitz was unknown is used as a way to support that idea. That's, the Holocaust is unknown, Auschwitz is unknown, that Holocaust is unknowable. I think there's, a very strange link there, maybe even at a subconscious level. There's something going on there. And I also think that we will see a shifting in the terms of the debate. So we can no longer talk about a lack of information. I think people who talk about the lack of information, you can only talk about lack of information if you ignore Polish intelligence operations. And you ignore everything that's in the American newspapers, and you ignore what's in various other newspapers. You just can't do it. But what you can do, I suspect, is to talk about, was this information believed? And so what you're doing there when you're moving to a question about believability is shifting the debate from a historical narrative to a more psychological narrative, it seems to me. And where we should be is just thinking about the politics of knowledge of Auschwitz rather than the psychology of knowledge of Auschwitz. And I think maybe this idea of fetishizing Auschwitz plays a function. The idea that this place was something more than, was different than other death camps in a very strange way is quite disturbing. And I'll just finish there.
Okay.
At that point.
Okay, thank you.